has this digression, as he calls it, which is titled A Mystery of Kremlinology. Why was this guy sacked and what's going on here? And how can that not be interesting? So I began looking at that, and it was also the time when a number of documents had begun to be published from the Soviet archives, particularly the transcripts of the July plenum of 1953 when they were attacking Beria. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about this particular question, but ultimately I didn't find enough. I went to Kiev twice in 2005 and 2007 to work in the party archives. But I ended up writing a different article about the same period, one that was about patronage and betrayal that I published in 2008. What made me want to return to this is reading the article by Michael Loder. So this is another continuing the morning's theme of work inspired by Michael Loder. And his article about, it can be a subtitle for the conference. His article about Beria and Khrushchev, and particularly the nationalities question and Latvia and how that related to it. And that made me realize, first of all, that a lot more stuff has become available, has been published especially from the Russian archives about related to this question. And that there's even more stuff to be found that there's, for example, the CIA assessments of this event have been recently released for the last 5 or 10 years. And there has been more scholarship by Ukrainian and Russian scholars about this question. So I wanted to return to it. And this was early to mid-February. I also figured I could hop over to Kiev and do more archive research in the party archive. That became delayed, and I'm still hopeful that that will be possible in the not too distant future. But so what is going on here? So why is this such an interesting question? So the removal of a first secretary of a Union Republic, as the CIA assessment made clear, this was the biggest political event since Stalin's death. This is taking place in the background of Stalin dying in early March of 1953, this conflict for power that breaks out among his top lieutenants. And Beria is first off the mark, the so-called 100 days of Beria between March and June of 1953, where he's sort of in the driver's seat, undertaking a lot of changes, a lot of attempts. And I think what's happening here in the post-Stalin deinstitutionalization of the system, each of the players are sort of not understanding, nobody really knows where power lies. And each of them is trying to grab for those institutional bases where they think that those might be. So for Beria, essentially, that's his power bases that exist already in the regional network in the Transcaucasus, his networks in the police, in the secret police, his networks in industry that he had been responsible for in the Second World War, trying to put those together and fundamentally making an alliance with Melnikov. And I'll get back to why that's important later. Beria undertakes these reforms, right? He tries to present himself as a figure that is not his reputation as simply the secret police guy. He's trying to present himself, and this is made very clear in a number of different studies over the last 40 years, that he's trying to present himself as a nationalities guy. He's appealing to the periphery, he's appealing to the nationalities all around the Soviet Union on the basis of his experience as a minority himself, his experience in the Transcaucasus. He's also, because one of his bases is the Interior Ministry, he's very clearly trying to put forward the power of the Interior Ministry over the government and over the party, and doing this in a very methodical way of replacing the heads of the Interior Ministry in the republics, putting his own people, and then slowly trying to push the power of those newly placed MVD officials over the local party. And this comes to a head in a number of places, but particularly it comes to a head in Ukraine. And Ukraine becomes a particular battlefield of this, in part because it's an essential battle over who holds power, but it's also a battle between the competing magnates. Ukraine is a central patronage asset of Khrushchev, right? In a similar way that Beria is a representative of the new model, late Stalinist model of how patronage works, right? Not just small regional centers, but combining regional patronage networks with institutional ones in different spheres. Khrushchev is doing the same thing, right? With his basis in the Moscow City Organization, in the Ukraine, and the Ukrainian Party Organization, in the Ukrainian front of the army, and bringing those together. So for Khrushchev, Beria's activities, the same thing that he's doing in multiple places, becomes a particular threat. But why does it go so far that Melnikov, the first party secretary of Ukraine, is removed? So he is criticized. There are a series of notes, the so-called Decolonizing zapiski, that are collected in the peripheries, mainly based on criticisms of nationality policy. Most of these are directly motivated by Beria, but not all of them. And Melnikov is the target of one of these, that the policies in particularly in Western Ukraine have been Russifying, that they have been undermining local language laws, that they have been undermining local clients and so forth. The classic story that we know about this, I think, really comes from after Beria's fall, and exactly these transcripts of the July plenum, and particularly the reports of two of the players. Strokach, Timofey Strokach, who had been the previous head of the Interior Ministry, the previous Minister of Internal Affairs, who had been demoted by Beria and sent to Lviv as the local NKVD guy or MVD guy, and also Serdyuk, about which we've been speaking in the context of Moldova, but here he was the party secretary for the Lviv Oblast. And Strokach makes a famous complaint about Beria. And about the activities of Beria's people in Ukraine. And he sends this to Serdyuk. Khrushchev basically has this, brings this front and center. So it's addressed to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev makes it central to the July plenum attacking Beria. And there's actually kind of very famous statements that Strokach makes when Beria directly attacks him. So there's a famous conversation, a telephone conversation, when Strokach is speaking to Beria, and Beria is telling Strokach to fuck off, basically. And he says this famous line that "Мы вас выгоним из органов, мы вас выгоним из органов, мы вас сотрем порошок, в лагерную пыль превратим. Ты понял? Ты понял или нет? Понял? Так, вот, учти." I have to do this with the Mongolian accent, I think. And so it becomes sort of demonstrative of what Beria is and what he had been trying to do and how he is trying to position the Interior Ministry over the party. So one thing that I tried to do in the paper is to sort of step back and understand why Beria is doing this, of what the greater knowledge that we have now about Beria's background can tell us about why Beria is doing this. And I think you can actually see a continuity in Beria's career, that what he is trying to do in 1953 is kind of a repeat of the way he came to power in the Transcaucasus in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. It was exactly through building up a cohort, a network in the secret police, which then gradually took over the positions of the party, moved into the party, sort of pushed out the previously dominant networks within the Transcaucasus party, and then brought it forward. Another thing that I talk about too is what this so-called new course with regard to nationality policy actually means, and how that might have been received by others. It's often referred to as a return to the Korenizatsiya, the indigenization of the 1920s. In some ways that's true, but it seems to me it's not a full 1920s return. It's not a return to the support of small nationalities everywhere. There's no talks about extraterritorial rights or anything like that. It seems to me that it's really more of a course correction. It's a return to the nationality policy that became standard really in the high Stalin period from the 1930s of indigenous rights to large union republics. Ukraine was always a little bit of an exception to that standard kind of a view of what was happening in the other republics. So this was really kind of a course correction of returning to what had been what continued to be the standard policy towards indigenization in the Transcaucasus, but in other republics as well. And here I think Michael Loder makes a good point that this was not something out of line with the other Politburo members. In particular, Beria and Khrushchev are actually working together in this, and Khrushchev actually continues this, speaks favorably of this new change and this new course in nationality policy, and it continues after Beria loses the conflict. So then brings to this ultimate question of what happened here. The standard definition, the standard explanation in the criminology literature, and this was a big topic, this removal of Melnikov back in the late 50s and the early 60s, and again also in the CIA assessments, is that Beria did this, and that it was a step too far. This seems questionable to me exactly because it was a huge mistake. What results from the removal of Melnikov is that Khrushchev gets his way in Ukraine. He puts his person, Kirilenko, he basically takes control. And it is that one of those factors which allows for Khrushchev to demonstrate to the other Politburo members that Beria is going too far. And one of the things that wins the battle. It's not the only thing, there are other elements to this, but one of the things that convinces. So it's a major loss. It's a major overreach for Beria, and it's a major mistake. But was it really his sole intention, or did he do this? I would really love to find a smoking gun that says actually that Khrushchev knocked over Melnikov. I have not been able to find that. I would be surprised if it exists at all, if we could ever get even the access that we had before in Russian archives and elsewhere. But it does seem to me that this was certainly a collective decision, and that the other members of the Politburo, and particularly Khrushchev, went along with this and pushed it forward. One of the things that helps to make that case is among the things that have been published. Actually, the best thing is an article by a Ukrainian scholar, a brief biography of Melnikov that was published back in 1989, a guy named Kuzhukalo, which points out that there was actually a meeting of the Presidium to discuss the accusations against Ukraine and against the First Secretary Melnikov 6 days before the famous decision was taken in the Presidium to remove him. And in that meeting, Melnikov actually pushed back and complained, and that he was harshly criticized for that, not by Beria, but by Khrushchev, Melnikov, Mikayan, and all of the other main leaders of this of the collective leadership group. It's based on that confrontation that takes place in this meeting of the Presidium, as the Politburo was then called, that compelled the creation of a committee, a commission made of other Ukrainian members of the Presidium, of the Central Committee, rather, the All-Union Central Committee, that was put together to draft complaints about Melnikov, which were then brought up in the famous meeting of May 26, when he was criticized, and ultimately the decision was taken to remove him. So if it was the case that Beria did this, why would he have done this? And that gets into the question of whose person was Melnikov. So in the late Stalin period, everybody was associated with everybody else. In the Kremlinology literature, the association is often made that Melnikov, although he started as an appointee of Khrushchev, that he broke with Khrushchev. Khrushchev criticizes him really heavily, actually, after then and later. That he must have been a person of Malenkov, if it's not Khrushchev. And so that this should be understood as an alliance, perhaps, between Beria and Khrushchev against Malenkov. That seems to be very unlikely, because if there's one thing I am absolutely certain of, and that was the topic of my first article, it's that Beria's strategy in the spring of 1953 was exactly this alliance with Malenkov, because Malenkov had access to the government institutions. That was a key that Beria lost. The central strategy of Khrushchev, I think, was to break that alliance. So I don't really think that there would be a basis for Beria and Khrushchev to align against Malenkov. What I think actually was happening, and I think here too is somewhere where I can make a contribution, is all of the Kremlinology literature, all of the Kremlinologists, including Conquest and Belinsky and the later seminar article by Charles Fairbanks, they exclude the possibility that Stalin himself ran local patrons. But I think he did. I can see clear parallels between Melnikov in Ukraine and Akakim Galadze in Georgia. Very similar situations. Galadze was the first secretary in Georgia. He was one of the Stalin new men, as Melnikov was, who was promoted into the Central Committee. Melnikov became a member of the Presidium. It was assumed that Galadze might be too. You also had very similar meetings between them that took place. There was the famous meeting between Stalin and Rukhadze and Galadze that presaged and basically set the stage for the Megrelian affair in Georgia. There was a very similar meeting that took place between Stalin and Melnikov in April of 1952, a 4-hour meeting in which they discussed things. So it seems to me that this is a very similar kind of a situation. That also explains what happens to both Galadze and Melnikov after this conflict ends. So both of them have career demotions and career delays. Neither of them are severely punished. They're removed as from high politics. Galadze worse, he basically ends up as a low-level functionary, as a party functionary in Georgia. Melnikov, not quite so bad. He ends up as an ambassador to Romania, I think, and then ends up as a factory director in Central Asia and elsewhere. So it's not, he's still in the nomenclatura, he's still an elite, but it's quite a fall from being the first secretary of Ukraine. So what I think it happens here is that this was that Melnikov was Stalin's local guy. That he was doing exactly the same thing with the Ukrainian Republic in the 2 years before, leading up to his death, that he was doing in the Georgian Republic. So again, I'm not able to find the smoking gun that says exactly who or why this happened. But it seems to me, again, unlikely that this was a singular decision taken by Beria and an overreach by Beria that led to this fatal mistake, but rather one that was collective. And ultimately, again, the evidence is circumstantial, but Khrushchev was the big winner from this. It really seems that Beria had walked into a trap, and that it seems that this trap was laid for him by Khrushchev. So that's where I am with this now. I thank you for your attention and would be happy to answer questions later on.
Our next speaker is Orysia Kulick, who's an assistant professor in political studies and German and Slavic studies at the University of Manitoba. She received her PhD in history from Stanford University in 2017. She has also held postdoctoral fellowships at Trinity College Dublin and at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on regional elites in post-Stalin Soviet Ukraine, the personal networks that shaped its relations with Moscow, and how both influenced politics in the center of Soviet power. The second project is a microhistory of the concentration camp, Mittelbau Dora, which follows a small group of Ukrainian nationalists and into underground tunnels where the Nazis manufactured their infamous V1 and V2 missiles. And Orysia's paper today is on decolonizing the Canon, Ukraine and the transformation of Soviet politics under Khrushchev.
Thank you, Natalya. Thank you, everyone. I wanted to begin by thanking Mike for bringing us all together. After such a long hiatus, I know it's been long in the making, and I appreciate your commitment to furthering conversations among political historians of Ukraine. I've noticed that there's nervous chuckling every time someone mentions Kiev or Ukraine or not being able to travel. I hope that ceases because I'm about to mention that as well. This is my first trip to Europe in 3 years. And although I'm very happy to be here, it's bittersweet. Can you not hear me, Natalya? Okay. I have a low voice, so I'll try to project. This is my first trip to Europe in 3 years. And although I'm very happy to be here, it is bittersweet. In normal times, this would have been a stop on my way to Kyiv for a summer of family, friends, and archival research. Ukraine is now in a fight for its life. And Kyiv, the mother of Russian cities, was hit again just days ago by Russian artillery fire, taking aim yet again at transport infrastructure that supports grain exports. Russia is very clearly weaponizing grain and deliberately targeting fields, seed banks, and other agricultural infrastructure. To cripple Ukraine, or Zhytnitsa Evropy, the wheat basket of Europe, in its attempt to break it. Moscow has orchestrated famine within the Soviet Union for ideological ends. Why would it stop at using global famine as a weapon in this particular war? So there's some continuities to think about here. And after what we've seen from Russia, I'm not sure anything is off limits, including the destruction of historic Kiev. I struggled quite a bit actually preparing my remarks for today. I wrote 4 drafts and this is the 5th. So not only is my mind elsewhere, as it would be with any Ukrainianness that you might come across either today or at future conferences. My mind is elsewhere with loved ones, friends, colleagues whose lives have been shattered by this war. But I've also been feeling a kind of a sense of malaise about my own research. And it clicked for me why this was after I listened to Olesya Khromichuk's brilliant keynote at BASIS this year. If you haven't seen it yet, if you haven't watched it, you really should. She asked a simple question with a very sobering answer. Where is Ukraine on our mental maps in the academic community, in our classrooms, in our priorities as a field? Largely absent was her answer, with serious consequences, not just for pedagogy and the production of knowledge, but for Ukraine's national security. Because of the state of our mental maps, we are not prepared to meet this moment as a field. It's devastating to me that as a scholar of this region, that it took the threat of Russia potentially wiping Ukraine off the map of 21st century Europe for there to be widespread calls to decolonize the field. Russian and Slavic studies revolves, even now, around a country that just over 100 days ago launched a war of aggression on a fraternal neighbor, a vindictive, nasty colonial war of conquest with no nadir, it seems. Ukraine, by contrast, has never had full historiographical legitimacy in Russian, Soviet, and Slavic studies. As Khrushchev puts it, Ukraine and other nations that fall under the umbrella of Russian and Slavic studies are made to float like satellites around their big neighbor, desperately competing for resources in the academy. This is an acute problem whose solution is long overdue. Recent calls to decolonize the field are quite welcomed, but I fear that they may have come too late. Ending Russia's imperial innocence, as Botakoz Kazembekova and Marlene Laruelle wrote recently, or unpacking the grand theory driving Putin to war, as per Jane Burbank in the New York Times, are a nice beginning. I prefer Susan Smith-Peters' blunter framing. What do scholars of Russia owe Ukraine? The answer, she says, is undertaking, quote, a searching moral inventory to see the ways in which we have taken the Russian state's point of view as default, end quote. Smith-Peter recalls an essay, that has come up a lot in recent times, Mark von Hagen's question from 1995 about whether Ukraine had a history. Compelled by the state of the field then to argue for its institutionalization in Anglo-American, German, and Japanese academic centers. Years later, von Hagen admitted the essay was meant to prove his worth as a Ukrainianist to his Russian history colleagues. But it was also an important intellectual and moral challenge to broaden the scope of understanding Russian, Soviet, East European, and Eurasian history by centering Ukraine, as we would say it today. What are sometimes viewed as Ukraine's weaknesses or liabilities, the fluidity of its frontiers, the permeability of its cultures, could make Ukrainian history, he thought, a very modern field of inquiry, one that could challenge conceptual hegemonies and explore the most contested issues of identity formation, cultural construction and maintenance, and colonial institutions and structures. In April of this year, Andriy Portnov and Tatiana Portnova, both scholars from Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk, referred to von Hagen's article in a renewed plea to grant full historiographical legitimacy to Ukraine. I thought to myself, can we really have made so little progress since the mid-1990s? Ukrainian studies is and remains largely isolated, a field unto itself. This was already the case before the war, and without radical reframing or a paradigm shift, as the Portnovs write, or a permanent alteration, in the words of Khrushchev, this will continue to be the case. Multiple missed opportunities to bring Ukrainian scholars of Ukraine, and Russianists into conversation have done irreparable damage to Russian and Soviet studies. And it's a shame, because if you center Ukraine, it opens up a world of analytical possibility, as evidenced, I would say, by the paper just given by Timothy Blauvelt. I know this may seem like a long segue into the discussion of the role of Ukraine in Khrushchev era politics, but I felt the historiographical detour was necessary to explain the origins of my book manuscript. My research has been driven by the need to break out of what I call historiographical claustrophobia, that feeling of being hemmed in by a field that is not properly integrated Ukraine. This is how you get a book manuscript titled, only somewhat cheekily, How Ukraine Ruled Russia, Regionalism and Party Politics After Stalin. I made a lot of friends in the last couple of years with this book. At the most basic level, the book engaged arguments laid out by Merle Feinsod and Jerry Huff long ago. And I thought that, by examining these Khrushchev era connections, it would be taking them to what seemed like the logical conclusion of patterns observed in the post-Stalin period. In the archival evidence and other documents that I found about the post-Stalin Soviet Union. My research explores changes in the Soviet system by means of collective study. A group of approximately 50 officials on a variety of career tracks, mostly mid to lower level bureaucrats, some of whom reached the pinnacle of Soviet power, but not all. I traced my protagonists through archives in Moscow, Kyiv, Lviv, Dnipro. They have enough in common socially, professionally, and biographically for me to uncover underlying connections, which are the basis of important social webs that are also Soviet precursors to regional groupings that we now refer to as oligarchic clans. This method balances out ego documents, memoirs, letters, diaries, and newspaper accounts with deep interrogation of archival sources. Most of the officials I researched come from the periphery, from the southwestern periphery of Russia. In particular, a cluster of old imperial provinces that ended up on either side of the Russo-Ukrainian administrative border established by the Soviets. Most of the officials in my book come from a smaller area on the Ukrainian side of the border, which you may recognize from maps accompanying news stories since 2014. This land was called Orysia during the reign of Catherine the Great. It was formed in 1764 from annexed Ottoman and Cossack territories and those belonging to the Crimean Khanate, and expanded over time. Russian President Vladimir Putin resurrected this term in 2014 as a pretext and justification for Russian involvement in Ukraine. The decision to approach my research in this way was shaped by the nature of Soviet archives, which we all know are vast and overwhelming and hold the detritus of the official world bureaucrats. And also the question that I set out to answer, why Dnipropetrovsk and why not somewhere else? In other words, how did it come about that by the time of Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union's fifth leader, there were so many of his compatriots in the Kremlin that people complained that the Soviet Union was being run by a mafia from Dnipropetrovsk? Explanations for this phenomenon, both scholarly and popular, often turned to patronage and personal networks, which were admittedly very, very important, but from what I was reading, not the whole explanation. And because I love this turn of phrase, I just want to remind how Meryl Feinsod described this famously in his book, How Russia is Ruled from 1953. These personal entourages forms an essential ingredient in the informal life of the party. Quote, Soviet careers made by clinging to the coattails of the great lords of communism, and cliques rising and falling in the Soviet hierarchy depending on the fortunes of their patrons. Scholars who study the Soviet bureaucracy closely know that the situation is more fluid. This facade of patronage masking camouflaged processes of bureaucratic representation and manipulation. You can see that evolution in Feinsod's subsequent book co-authored with Jerry Huff, titled How the Soviet Union Was Governed. So you see a really important shift in language. The growing complexity of the Soviet system is acknowledged. The reforms undertaken by Stalin's successors are factored in when depicting how the Union worked. But the authors noted that there were limits to what they could see, and that the story would have to be continued when we had more information about the very dynamic and also murky Khrushchev period, when Ukraine figures centrally and not peripherally. And this non-peripherality is, I think, a really important shift. Khrushchev oversaw the decentralization of political and economic decision-making in the 1950s and early 1960s, which redistributed power and increased the number of non-Russian speakers in leading party and government organs. These changes reverberated throughout the Soviet Union and seemed to benefit regional elites from Soviet Ukraine in an outsized way. Regional elevating officials from Dnipro, from Kyiv, from Donetsk, and other important cities and regions. Regional networks in Ukraine, as we just heard, figured prominently in the post-Stalin succession struggle, and later in the removal of Khrushchev. So one's fortunes could also fall based on those same networks. Those of us who study Soviet officials look at certain kinds of data: patronage, personal ties, the nomenclatura system of appointments, the culture within certain branches of the bureaucracy, and regional affiliation. Education and early career ties are sometimes discussed as important. People who met and worked alongside one another in the early stages of their careers, such as lower ranking party and state officials in the Donbass or Dnipro or Stavropol. They tended to stick together as they moved up and down the hierarchy. The Ukrainian story brings other elements into play, as John Armstrong argued in his work, The Soviet Bureaucratic Elite, a case study of the Soviet Ukrainian apparatus. This was written in 1959, so quite some time ago. And he observed crucial differences in the Ukrainian case. Its politics were shaped by a Stalinist mode of rule, which deliberately pitted regional elites against one another, but also gave them a robust training ground for a newer, nimbler system. Soviet Ukrainian officials, as per John Armstrong, had a much nimbler approach to bureaucratic politics. They were more flexible, which aided them greatly in the post-Stalin transition, which Armstrong describes as a period of oligarchization of the Soviet bureaucracy. Though working with a limited source base, Armstrong makes incisive analyses into dynamics particular to the Ukrainian bureaucracy and how new cadres may form going forward, so after 1959. Higher levels of education would cause a generational rift. This issue of intergenerational analysis came up earlier. Armstrong also saw it as a potential source of tension, as it would widen the gap between party and state bureaucracies, which were once run interchangeably by generalists. The development of cross-institutional alignments between party, state, and industrial manager groups in the industrial Donbass coal region created already in the 50s, partially distinct groupings enjoying considerable insularity from central control, and that only deepened in subsequent years. These cross-institutional groupings also helped empower regional officials and are precursors to oligarchic formations that coalesced in the same regions after independence. One final observation he had is that Soviet officialdom faced considerable demographic pressure from below. And this is a consequence of the Stalinist purges of the 1930s. The near total annihilation of Ukraine's top leadership, for instance, I think something like 98% of Ukraine's Central Committee was executed. This created a power vacuum at the very top, which needed to be filled with sweeping infusions of appointees, and more frequently than in the RSFSR. So the rate of turnover was faster, the rate of change was faster, and that was creating pressure from below and from Soviet Ukraine, and this propelled a lot of change in the Khrushchev period. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to I'm just going to say that I've written several articles on the topic that are on the table that deal with the intersection of these regional elites with the military industrial complex, and how those nexuses sort of contributed to this phenomenon. But I also want to say that going through all of this archival information and trying to make sense of it, I just wanted to thank Natalya, who wrote a marvelous book on the Sovnarkhoz reforms. That was a lifeline for me when I was writing my dissertation. It was, and helped me make sense of the archival information that I was reading. So thank you very much. And one of the reasons which is that, you know, this interplay between people, enterprises, and local governance structures is really important. And the sort of Sovnarkhoz reforms really impacted this in substantial ways. And it was happening as the Soviet Union's economy was remilitarizing. So you have, you know, devolving power to the regions, remilitarizing, ramping up military production, and these things were at odds. And you know, certain each branch of the economy wanting maximal control. What ends up happening at the regional level is that military and civilian production facilities both end up falling under the control of the Sovnarkhozes. This makes it possible for cooperative ties to develop between them. blurring the distinction between enterprises subordinated to the Ministry of Defense in Moscow and those who reported directly to local officials. And this expanded the professional and social networks of these officials working in the regions, and sometimes local party and state organs tasked with building housing for specialists or providing them with auxiliary support would sometimes place orders at defense facilities, which were in a much better position to expediently serve local needs. So you see how these highly stratified, strategically important locations then figure into this larger story of how the Soviet Union changed after Stalin. And in Soviet Ukraine, that tension has very important consequences, but it isn't contained to the Republic. It not only shaped clashes between various factions within the Soviet Ukrainian nomenclatura, so Dnipro versus Kyiv or something along those lines. This also facilitated the movement of Soviet Ukrainian officials into Moscow in sizable numbers. And these aren't ethnic Ukrainians necessarily, these are people who happen to be living and working in Soviet Ukraine. And the consolidation of the Dnipropetrovsk group in the 70s is intimately tied to these developments in Ukraine and the power struggle that sort of unfolded therein. This question could be studied much more in depth. And I would say not for lack of evidence. As John Armstrong's work from the 1950s demonstrates, it's also tied to modes of seeing. What we choose to see, what we choose not to look at. And in a field predisposed to not seeing Ukraine, this is a big problem. So I don't know where that leaves us as a field, especially now. I'm not particularly optimistic regarding our ability to bridge these divides, but I think people in this room are uniquely qualified to do so. But progress will require dominant privileged voices to listen, and some self-reflection would go a very long way. So this war has changed things and will for decades to come. I hope this time we take up the call to integrate and institutionalize Ukrainian studies rather than continuing to keep the subfield at arm's length. Thank you for your time.
Much, Orysia, for this thought-provoking talk. Our third speaker is Jeremy Smith, who is currently a professor of history at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. He has written extensively on nationality issues in the Soviet Union and on the organization of the post-Soviet space as well. Jeremy published the book, The Red Nations, the Nationalities Experience in and After the USSR in 2013. And he published several co-edited volumes, including Khrushchev and the Kremlin and State and Society under Khrushchev with Melanie Ilia, and Georgia After Stalin, Nationalism and Soviet Power with Timothy Blauvelt. He's currently involved in a project on history of Soviet Georgia, where he is writing on the politics and policies of the year 1951 to 1972. And Jeremy's talk today is on the Third Republic, wine, sport, engineering, and soft power in Georgia under Mzhavanadze.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation, which I almost had to turn down because, as mentioned, most of the work I've done in the last few years has actually been on post-Soviet space, so the 1990s and after. But fortunately, about a year ago, I was approached by Stephen Jones and Becca Kolbakidze, who are doing, as you mentioned, a project on the history of Soviet Georgia. So it's a kind of co-authored book, which is a history of Georgia under the Soviet Union. And I was tasked with writing a chapter essentially on the politics of Georgia between 1951 and 1972. So this is the only thing so I've gone back to what I was doing before Georgia in the 1950s, and this is what I'm doing in relation to the Soviet Union at the moment, and everything else is post-Soviet. So it gives me the opportunity at a very early stage of looking at this, really to present an idea. It's a hypothesis, really. It's backed up a bit by some fairly random sampling of documents in the archives of the Georgian Communist Party, which I was able to do at the beginning of last month. So the problem I had with this period is that, writing a chapter about this period between 1951 and 1956, lots is happening. There's plenty to write about. There's the Mingrelian Fair, there's the fallouts from the death of Lenin, there's the fallouts from death of Stalin, there's the fallout from the arrest of Beria. There's various things going on in relation to Abkhazia. And of course, there's the March 1956 events, which has now been mentioned twice in the introductions. Me and Tim did a whole project and a volume on. So there's plenty to write about there. But then the question is, what do we write about, and how do we characterize Georgia under Mzhavanadze between 1956 and 1972? Because really, until Shevardnadze is appointed as first secretary of Georgia, there doesn't appear to be a lot happening, and this period is generally characterized as a period where corruption is allowed to flourish in Georgia, where the grey economy is flourishing. So actually, according to official statistics, the Georgian economy is doing very badly throughout this period. But from informal, anecdotal accounts, and I think there is a consensus about this, that there is this massive informal economy, which probably makes Georgia one of the most prosperous republics in the Soviet Union at the time. So these features of, and things like the grey economy and corruption by their nature are difficult to research in, because, they're all unrecorded. I mean, there is some things I can say about that, and we have found some material in the archives about that, but it's still kind of looks like, this is what dominates this period. Mzhavanadze was, allowed this to happen. He managed it quite well. He was a good manager. In the sense that he managed to keep Moscow off the back of the Georgians as they engaged in these various kind of wheelings and dealings and building up this great economy and so on. And but is this all we have to go on to characterize Soviet Georgia in this period? And one of the first documents I looked at kind of confirmed this rather dull picture. The records, or I looked at the main speeches, at least, of the Georgian Party Congress in 1960. And what really struck me about this is this was only 4 years after the momentous events of 1956 in Georgia. And all of the themes, there are various inquests into the 1956 demonstrations and its consequences. And the themes that were raised there, like, the need to do ideological work amongst the youth, the need to deal with Georgian nationalism, incorrect nationality policy in Georgia, language policies, dealing with the remnants of Beria's network, and so on. These are all the things that were highlighted in 1956. They don't get a mention, or they barely get a mention at all in 1960. It's like, we just forget about that, pretend it never happened. We just get on with, essentially with managing the economy. So most of the speeches, most of the content of the 1960 Party Congress is about looking at various sectors of economy, and some of them are doing well and over-fulfilling plans, others are struggling, and so on and so on. So really not very interesting. But the idea I want to present I come at from a number of angles, and this is the idea of the Third Republic. So what do I mean by the Third Republic? Well, obviously Russia is the first republic, Ukraine is the second republic, kind of goes without saying. But which is the third in terms of ranking of republics in the Soviet Union? Which is the third republic? Which is the most important? Is it Belarus because it's the other Slavic republic, and there are a number of indicators that I've come across, and part of this also goes back to my old work I did some time ago on Georgian winemaking, which I'll come on to in a bit. Is that there is a kind of competition going on here. There is a competitiveness, probably in other, I think in other republics generally, but particularly it seems a concern of the Georgian Communist Party leadership to kind of show how Georgia is better than the other, or at least is best of the rest. Can't compete with Russia, can't compete with Ukraine, but in a number of fields, well, in some fields, especially winemaking, can compete actually with those and have the leading position. But in other respects, can boast to be, culturally and so on, the most significant republic after the two biggest ones. And the idea, well, one thing that pushes me in this direction is there's quite a lot of attention again, based on fairly random sampling of archive material paid to sport and sport performance in Georgia. And so it really came to me in one report I found from 1970, which is a long report looking at sport and reviewing the performance of Georgian participants in the previous Spartakiad. So what's a Spartakiad is the Soviet Union had Spartakiads, which were like a communist version of the Olympics. So the Olympics, you know, the name is taken from the Mountain of the Gods. Well, of course, for the communists, we name our big sporting events after Spartacus, the slave rebel. And originally in 1950s, the Spartakiads were kind of a sporting, like an Olympics, but confined to the communist countries, to the East European communist countries and the Soviet Union. But by the 1960s, it was the big sporting event just for the Soviet Union. And there were different versions of it, but the really big one was the Spartakiad of Peoples of the USSR. And this report made a lot of the fact that at the previous Spartakiad, which I think was in 1968, but I need to check that date, that Georgia had won the third largest amount of medals. So behind Russia and Ukraine, you've got Russia, Ukraine, Georgia. So Georgia's in third place. And this is very important. It's very important to maintain this position. And so a lot of this report is looking forward to the next Spartakiad of Peoples of the USSR. It's also looking forward to the Munich Olympics, which will be in 1972. So there's also an international dimension to this as well. So I use the word soft power in the title, which is normally used in international relations, of this kind of gaining recognition, influence through peaceful means. This idea developed in the 1980s in the context of the United States, but very kind of popular with international relations people today. And so part of what I see in Georgia in these different fields is promoting Georgia internationally, but it's also promoting Georgia domestically, i.e. in the context of the Soviet Union. And this seems to be a thread that runs through quite a lot of this period. And like I say, it's kind of a hypothesis at the moment. I've got some evidence for it, some clues, but I hope to work more on it. And I think it's also perhaps an interesting framework for looking at the Soviet Union more generally in terms of competition, if you like, at a certain level between republics to you know, and we've been talking a lot already, and we'll be talking some more about first secretaries and so on, leaderships in the political republics, and certainly from the Khrushchev period onwards, I think it's quite clear that there is these people are looking after their republics first and foremost, but I think this idea of a competitiveness as well at a certain level might be worth exploring more. So just looking at a couple of the areas of this in relation to Georgia, starting with sport. I mean, there was already a basis for this, and I've seen in earlier reports as well, and these have been discussed by the Bureau of the Communist Party of Georgia. So it's, you know, it's the highest political level. You know, there's a basis for it in the success of the Dinamo Tbilisi football team, which enjoyed a lot of success in the 1940s and 1950s, and in 1964 became, I'm pretty sure, the first team outside Moscow or Kiev to win the Soviet top league. So again, Georgia was ahead of the rest in those terms. The reports on the Olympics, consistently, you know, significant numbers of gold medals being won by Georgian athletes in the Olympic Games, mostly in wrestling, which was seen as a traditional Georgian sport, but also in a couple of other disciplines like fencing, I think was one, and I can't remember what else. So this was, and again, there are a number of reports which talk about building on that, maintaining the level of performance of Georgian athletes at the Olympic Games, as well as at the Soviet Spartakiads. And there are quite, you know, significant practical implications of this, like building sports halls, you know, encouraging, you know, sport participation, not just at schools, but at factories, at universities, in kolkhozes and so on. And at least, whether these investments ever happen, but at least there are plans for very wide-scale investments in sports facilities, aimed both at promoting the health of the population, by getting more people involved in sport, but also at producing elite Georgian athletes who can therefore demonstrate the mightiness of Georgia, if you like, on both the world and the Soviet stages. So sport is one area which, obviously sport is competitive. So it's an area where there's obvious competition and attempts to advance Georgia's profile. Going back to, the work I did a while ago on Georgian winemaking in the 1950s and 1960s, I think fits into this picture as well. So there are a number of reasons why Georgia, apart from the fact that Georgian wine is so good, as we know, and so famous, and already in Tsarist times, and so, but there are real efforts to increase both the quantity and especially the quality of Georgian wines during the 1950s. And indeed earlier than that, in fact, because part of the advantage that Georgia got in this respect was that the other main wine producing regions of the Soviet Union, namely Ukraine and Moldova, Ukraine including Crimea, a lot of the wine stocks that had been, the vineyards had been destroyed during the Great Patriotic War. And there are various programs to try and replace them with Hungarian vines and things, but they didn't work. They were all diseased and didn't take on. So Georgia, of course, hadn't suffered in the same way from those impacts, and so was able to really kind of position itself as the leading wine producing region of the Soviet Union, at least in terms of quality wines. And a number of things combined, first to really make a renewed push in Soviet winemaking. One was Khrushchev's general emphasis on technology as the way to increase productivity and to improve quality and so on. And generally improve production. Second factor was in 1955, policy from 1955 onwards, a policy of much greater openness in terms of international scientific cooperation with the West. And the third factor was the 1957 Sovkhoz reform, which allowed Georgia gave Georgia more leeway in deciding its own industrial and agricultural policies. And so, again, there are a number of documents come across where they talk about improving, expanding the production of, expanding the area of vineyards and expanding the production of wine, but also what I wrote about was some 10 or 12 years ago, or I think longer ago, about the efforts to improve the technology behind the winemaking and therefore to improve the quality of the wines itself, which involved sending delegations to France and studying how the French did, so introducing, modernizing the wine industry in using new technologies while still maintaining the distinctive character of Georgian wine and the traditional, or elements at least, of the traditional Georgian winemaking processes. And Georgia positioned itself as a leading winemaking area of the USSR, hosted the USSR conference on, I think the first one, post-war one at least, on wine technology in 1958. And it's a kind of crowning glory for Georgia in 1962. Tbilisi hosted the 10th World Congress of Vines and Wines, the International Committee for Vines and Wines, I think was the full title. So this was a big kind of international, feather in the cap of Georgia, because it was now hosting a major international wine event, and at the same time it was able to use that event again to promote Georgian wines as the best of the Soviet Union. Also, a lot of attention was paid again at the higher political levels to the performance of Georgian wines in international wine competitions, which there were many. Mostly Soviet wines were being entered into Eastern Bloc competitions. There's a big one every year in Ljubljana and places like Hungary and Romania. But they were also being entered in wine competitions and winning medals, and mostly it was the Georgian wines that were winning medals in places like Belgium and Austria. So that, and I think there's a similar story with the tea industry as well, with Georgian tea as well, which again was internationalized, and they made contacts with India and so on to learn about technologies and techniques and so on, but I haven't really looked into that. So these are the main areas that I've been able to look at or started to explore anyway, in terms of sport and the production of high quality goods, wine and tea, and mostly wine and tea, I suppose. But there are other areas in which you see consistent political efforts for Georgia to position itself as a leading holiday center, of course, for the Soviet Union with its climate, beaches, and so on. And also the other part that's in the title, which was engineering, which I haven't looked into, but I think it's very important. And again, it recurs a lot, and there's a lot of kind of boasting and showing off, if you like, about these engineering achievements. So again, Georgia was the, if you look at how metro systems were constructed in the Soviet Union, it goes, the first is in Moscow, of course, then it's Leningrad, then it's Kiev, and then it's in 1965, I think it's the Tbilisi metro opens a year ahead of the metro being opened in Baku. I mentioned this to some Azerbaijani historians the other weeks, and they didn't believe it. They think there's some skullduggery going on there. But and that story as well, that there is a story to be told there, and I really hope we can find some material, because again, it's kind of anecdotal evidence that this was all privately funded. It was funded by Georgian businessmen who had been making money out of a grey economy, and so it was kind of constructed unofficially, if you like. And other areas where, again, you see a lot of attention being paid in the congresses, in regular discussions at the Bureau. Tbilisi's historical place as the leading railway engineering center for the South Caucasus, of course, and therefore one of the leading ones, excuse me, for the whole Soviet Union. And then there are other projects, like Tbilisi launches quite early on its television center, so you're able to get television broadcasts, at least in parts of Georgia earlier than in most other places. And then there are the big hydroelectric dams and so on. Other things I can mention which fit into this picture, this kind of soft power picture, well, hosting international events like the winemakers event, a lot of emphasis on a lot of anniversaries being celebrated. Admittedly, this was happening in all kinds of Soviet republics in the 1950s and 1960s, but you have the 1500 years of the city of Tbilisi, you have various anniversaries of the births and deaths of the great Georgian writers and so on. And these are all, a big deal is made out of these events politically. And then finally, what I haven't really included, because I'm not going to include it in this chapter because someone else is dealing with it, I think it also ties into here. We know well the history, the competition that has been going on between historians in the South Caucasus at this time over, historical claims and who was the original peoples and territorial claims and so on. So this is kind of a lens for looking at, one part is certainly not the whole story, but one part of what is going on in Georgia during the 1960s, essentially. It's this idea of really promoting the image of Georgia and its place as, well, as I call it, as the Third Republic. Thank you.
Thank you all for this for such short voting talks. Can I please invite Cynthia to back of the table and brace themselves for some questions? So I'll follow the established pattern of taking a couple of questions and scoring them off. So you're on first, and Ilia or
I have sort of questions which are going to go in reverse order. Let's start with you, Jeremy, and then go to Tim. You, Jeremy, there are a number of processes here which are not parallel. Is what's the unifying thread? I think that's the difficult bit. And when, for example, you talk about sports and the Spartacus and competition, soft power. A lot of the kind of work on soft power suggests that it exists in order to achieve a particular goal. So it's not just there for its own sake, but it might be there to open new markets and to spread some kind of neoliberal order, or there may be particular kind of goals that are served by soft power. And with sport, I'm just wondering what that particular goal is. What is it they want to achieve? I mean, other than simply being good at something, and that in itself is an power. And I kind of wonder. I mean, it could be. It's not nationalism, but it could be like a national consciousness, or it could be something else. What they want to do is deflect attention from Moscow, because there's all this stuff going on, the grey economy, there's corruption, and so on. And they want to kind of give Moscow the impression that everything is kind of under control and that they're competent and it's a well-managed republic. With wine, I mean, it's very, very interesting. I kind of wonder whether I had a sense it's moving in a slightly different direction, but I don't know what that is, but it might be to do, it could be to do with entrepreneurship, it could be to do with redistribution of wealth. So they're generating wealth and they want to find some way of kind of redistributing across the republic. And what I'm sort of getting at is that there may be these processes may be pushing in slightly different directions, and I just wonder what the overall kind of umbrella concept is that kind of brings them all together. Tim, I have a kind of rather different kind of question for you, and it's I just wonder whether there might be a much simpler explanation to what you're trying to explain, which is the removal of Melnikov. And it might be this, that when Stalin dies, there are two leaders who have some kind of networks that stretch across the Soviet Union. And Manitoba isn't one of them. The two leaders are Beria and Khrushchev. And Beria's network across the country is through the secret police and the MBD and so on, and Khrushchev's is through the party. And so there's a clash between these two groups. And then what you get in Ukraine is a particular clash where Melnikov, quite early on in this conflict, attaches himself to Beria. And then you get Strukach moving to West Ukraine, to Lvov, and there's this terrible conflict there between various people and Strukach about the national composition of the Communist Party. And there's an enormous amount of pressure that's placed on the local Communist Party to release its information, and they won't do it. And that's what leads to this kind of huge showdown with Beria. And there are very interesting, I mean, if you look at the June 1953 Central Committee plenum, there's a very interesting moment where Kaganovich says, what Beria wanted was to have information on us, on the party, whereas of course we know it has to be the other way around. We have to have the information on them. And the reason they got rid of him, Melnikov, was because Melnikov sided with Beria in this conflict between party and the civil service. So that's I think a relatively plausible argument to explain this removal.
Thank you. I'll take the speakers to think about that meanwhile.
I have a question to Orysia, and I like very much the idea of decolonizing the state of research or what you're doing, and I was trying to think about it in the last weeks or months at the beginning of war, and I think we probably will come back to that on Friday morning. And I have to say, I'm no specialist in decolonization theory, etc., and how to apply this on historiography. And so, and I have to admit also that I did not get the point when you said that Dnipropetrovsk mafia, or using this term, is an example for how we should not treat history, or not. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this, and what is your idea of how to decolonize our writing? Because I always also was, of course, thinking about Brezhnev. I mean, I never treated him in national terms because it never came up from the sources, neither from the archive nor from all the memoirs or diaries or whatever I found. So is it the question that it didn't really matter to him? I mean, he wrote both in his biography that mother tongue is Russian or mother tongue is Ukrainian. Obviously, he also spoke Polish.
Mhm.
And or is it rather like Igor said, it's not so relevant what's in the sources. We have to talk to somebody to get the real grip of it.
Okay, shall we go in the order of speakers? So Timothy, maybe you start with Orysia.
Okay, well, I think my answer would be fairly simple, and that I think you're entirely right. And that's actually part of the story that I'm trying to tell. That, well, one is how Melnikov sort of gets left out of this. And I think it's because, as you say, he wasn't part of either the Khrushchev or the Beria group. I think he was directly a Stalin person, which then even left him more exposed after Stalin died. But I think it's also an important part of the story, as you say, that he actually, in sort of grasping for survival, was actually helping Beria. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why Strokach and Serduk get sort of lionized at the July plenum, why they're put forward as so heroic, because they resisted and put up with this terrible phone call from Beria. And one of the things actually that I found in the party archive in Kyiv is that when they were preparing these famous Decolonizing Zapiski, Melnikov actually did the research himself. He actually went to Western Ukraine and did this research. And so I think that is also undermines the argument of why was it that Beria, why would Beria remove this guy who's actually siding with him? So I think that would even contribute to this argument that if it was at least a more collective thing, and whoever actually took the decision, I think what is even more important is that the way that Khrushchev was able to weaponize it after the fact, and exactly using this testimony by Strokach, how horrible and how horrible Melnikov was for really being such a weak-kneed guy.
Oh, is it me? It is me. So I would answer your question in a couple of ways, I think. Like first, I wasn't necessarily suggesting, the figure of Brezhnev is the issue here. It's how we understand this sort of, how this group forms and how it manages to squeeze out competitors in both Soviet Ukraine and in Moscow. And I took as my approach, not focusing on these periods as distinct. So we deal with Khrushchev separately. There's this transition, this coup, and now we're in a new era. I thought, well, in terms of Soviet Ukraine, we don't know all that much about this period of massive reform. What happens if we sort of open it and think about this transition between the two? What happens on the cusp of this shift from the Khrushchev to the Brezhnev period, and examine these dynamics at various levels of the hierarchy, not thinking about the patron and necessarily and who the patron is trying to muscle out of office or outwit or press to the side, but what's happening with their pyramids and networks at the local level, at the regional level, and at the center. So this interplay, I mean, Mike, again, I'll just head to Mike Loader since everyone does that, but this working of the archives and, the All Union Center, the Republican Center, and then at the local or regional levels, and a sort of much more dynamic atmosphere comes into view. And with the Ukrainian case, there's a lot of memoirs for some reason from these officials from this particular period. So, and when the archival documentation starts to wane, the memoir accounts start to increase, and that also poses a problem. So, I mean, my solution was, okay, focus on 3 regions that each tell a story about Ukraine. So Dnipropetrovsk, Kyiv, Lviv. They each have separate relationships to each other, to the Republican center of power in Kyiv, and they all have different relationships to Moscow because of how everything is structured in the Soviet Union. And what do the changes that come in 2 sort of big chapters after Stalin mean for all of these people, and how do they sort of contribute to that evolution? That's how kind of just flipping the script instead of from this angle, but introducing multiple loci of analysis, multiple lenses, and also taking into account that, the patron also might, rise out of this milieu rather than be the one, setting the terms. So that's how I would answer. Oh, is that, I see you nodding. So, okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd forgotten there was a political scientist amongst us, so I should be more careful with these terms. But I mean, the problem, or at least two political scientists, but I mean, the problem with the term soft power is, yeah, I mean, originally it has this meaning you said, and it's very specific parts of American foreign policy with very specific aims, but it's been hijacked, and it's been hijacked from two directions. One is that at some point in the 2000s, the Russian foreign ministry in its concept documents started talking about soft power as that, we need more soft power. And it's kind of, it's supposed to be an analytical category, not a policy that governments admit to doing it. So that already kind of changes it a bit. And the other thing is, more recently, there's been a lot of writing on sport and soft power. And it is a much fuzzier kind of meaning. It's not, there aren't specific aims. It's just about, look how nice we are, how good we are, how Western we are, because we can host football matches in cases like Qatar and things like that. So it is that kind of, yeah, it's I should probably be more careful using the term, but it is that kind of fuzzier meaning that that I'm referring to here. And about a common thread, I mean, yeah, I mean, of course, this isn't the reason they expand the wine industry or anything, but it's the language, and I need to, find a lot more material on this and do this a lot more systematically and so on, because there is that, or, the impression I get so far in it, there's a lot of obsession with rankings and tables and, where we are in relation to other Soviet republics, or where we are in relation to the rest of the world, how many medals we win and things like that. And so that's a common thread. I'm not saying this explains why the wine industry assumes the importance it does in Georgia, but this becomes part of how it is presented, and so yeah, I think that's my answer.
It's still going on.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I've got 6 more questions down, but is anyone else who wants to be on the list of questions? I've got you down. Okay, great. So we will start now with a couple of questions. So Ron first, and Alex, Vice Marshal, and then I'll move on down my list. I've got all of you down.
So this is an odd moment for us and in Russian, Soviet, and other republics' history because of the war in Ukraine and the emotions and the way most of us probably feel about this war, which is a real horror. And it's as big an event, it seems to me, as the end of the Soviet Union. It's going to change the nature of the field, let alone the way the world sees things and sees Russia. I'm more optimistic probably than some about fate of Russian studies. I have to go from this conference immediately to Tartu, where there will be a panel on it, and I was pessimistic. And then I came here and I'm listening to these papers, and I see things are working pretty well here. And I don't know if this is what you mean by decolonization, but there's a really healthy representation of non-Russians. And I go back a long time, and I remember when it was all criminology and Moscow and Petersburg, Leningrad, let alone anyone else, not Kiev even so much. So that's important that that's happening. And we even have a Georgianist who's working on Ukraine. So a lot of decolonization. I think it'd be really interesting for us to examine, as part of this decolonization thing, the historiography of the history of Ukraine and where it fits into the profession. I can't imagine how you do Russian history or Soviet history, or now post-Soviet history, without Ukraine, right? I'm writing a book on nationalism and I'm dealing with the 19th century. You can't do Russian history, not only without Ukraine, but without Poland. And in some ways without Finland too, but Poland is so key, and it's not even part of the sphere that you now include in Russian studies. So it seems to me that's really important. There were moments when Ukraine was very central, oddly enough, during the Harvard Project, right? So suddenly Ukrainians, well, how was it used? Ukrainians stood in for Russians and Soviets. They may even call Russians. So, and here we had we're focusing on Ukrainians, but it's the imperial gaze, and it's the blurring of the distinction. And then the problem problem in my generation was, how do you deal with Ukrainian historians when they are, and I'm on the left. But
Wouldn't have guessed.
during the Cold War, the Ukrainians were allied with the most reactionary forces. It was a kind of narcissistic nationalism, it was even CIA oriented. So it was hard. And then real historians, real Ukrainian history began and seems to be flourishing to the point where you can have someone like Sergei Plotny see the whole end of the Soviet Union as centered in Ukraine, when we know it started in Armenia, right? So those kind of things happen. All of that said, I'm sorry to make these comments now because I should have saved them for tomorrow, but
I know, don't ruin it.
yeah, but I want to get it on the floor. There is a danger. And the danger is not so much from us, I think, but from what's going on outside, in the media, in government, because the war is so horrible. And because it's basically a terror war. And one side is right and one side is wrong. There's no question. Unprovoked, unnecessary, and so forth. So what's going to happen? Russia, once again, will be stereotyped and essentialized. And we'll be back to the same kind of cliches that will blur all the nuances, all the subtleties, all the complexities that this conference and others will try to do isolated inside university walls. And it seems to me that's going to be a struggle. Now, for a while, there'll be no way out of that because the emotions are so high. But it's something that we it seems to me, have to be aware of. And those aren't questions, but maybe the panelists will have something to say about it.
Thanks very much. So much for optimism. My next question is from Alex.
It's really an observation to an offering to assist Jeremy on Georgia's this idea of soft power actually I think is a useful one, and actually I think there's archival evidence that might tie this together. I recently returned from Albania, and for my sins while I was there, I decided to read a book about Albania in the 20th century called Post-Stalin to Now, which is a fascinating book about Albania, interesting Albania. But one of the things that came directly out of the book was that there was a serious tension between Moscow and Tirana as to the Albanian model of socialism. Albania had liberated itself, didn't the Red Army, they'd done it by themselves. And Moscow saw Albania as a model for the Middle East. They saw East Germany as a model for Western Europe, what European developed socialism would be, like partial room, Khrushchev idea of what advanced European socialist countries would look like. And they were saying to the Albanians, you should be the model for the Middle East. You should focus on agriculture, you should focus on soil improvement, you should focus on seeds and wines, and you'll be the model for the Middle East. Now, this was a serious source of tension because the Albanians didn't see themselves as part of the Middle East. They saw themselves as Europeans. They wanted steel factories, they wanted metallurgy, they wanted advanced technologies, and so on, as you can imagine. So but coming to the point, the Moscow in making these arguments to the Albanians and sort of this is how we see you, this is how you fit within the socialist community. They said very explicitly to the Albanians, go to Georgia. They have the same problems in Georgia as you have. Georgia's your model. That's what you should be aspiring towards. So maybe Georgia as a sort of republic fits. You know, maybe the Georgian local administration was able to instrumentalize this, actually aware that Moscow's looking, you know, what can we do with Georgia? What's Georgia for? Well, maybe it could be a template for, you know, less advanced, more agrarian form of socialism. And if the Georgian local apparatchiks were aware of this, there's every possibility that they could instrumentalize that, as you were saying, to cover up the grey economy, to say, look, we are useful to you. Turn a blind eye to other stuff we're doing because we can be a model for Albania.
Yeah.
I don't know, Orysia, if you want to respond to Ron's comments.
Sure.
And then Jeremy.
Well, I mean, the short answer is you're right. Like we have to really be aware of that tendency to essentialize not allow ourselves to go barreling down that road of stereotyping. I do have to say, we have to also be cognizant of, the emotion in the room. And I don't know what ACES is going to look like. I'm not optimistic because this room is one thing, but the sort of larger conversation, I think, is another matter. And there's a lot of stories cropping up, about scholars being steered away as graduate students from studying Ukraine. Why would you do that? Like, that's not important. As a graduate student in Russian language classes, my Russian teacher was like, Orysia, what is that? I said, it's Ukrainian. She said, what are you doing in here? You know Russian already. Then my other teacher, this is not that long ago. Ukrainian is so cute. It's the language of little children. Okay, like these are the dynamics in the classroom, in institutions of higher learning. And I think we should absolutely be aware of, the dangers that come from over-essentializing Russia, getting rid of all these nuances that we've been working so hard as a field to establish. But I think we also need to really reflect on, these kinds of, we call them microaggressions now, that happen between colleagues, that happen in the classroom, and that haven't really dissipated with all of this enthusiasm and scholarship that you're talking about. Right? I think internally we have a lot of work to do as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Alex. I was in Albania 2 weeks ago as well, and I flew there direct from Abu Dhabi, and nah, that's not going to work, definitely. But this is really, really interesting that Georgia was mentioned as a model by Soviet officials. So that's definitely something I should follow up. And yeah, no, that's really, and I mean, and reminds me a bit of how Azerbaijan in the 1920s was the model for the colonial world, and very much instrumentalized that as well. So yeah, thanks a lot for that. And maybe I'll get the title of the book off you and see if I can follow that up somewhere. That's very, very interesting.
Well, only I think to continue what Melissa said, I think that it does seem a positive development that even before this started, there was increasing attention to the periphery of the Russian Empire of post-Soviet world, and it looks like that may be continuing among students, among graduate students, and it seems that there's less of a idea that those who study the periphery are kind of freaks and weirdos in their own kind of separate world, and more of a drawing together. And we had sort of similar to what Alessia was saying. Our organization, American Councils, my non-academic side, we for years have been doing Russian language programs in republics outside of Russia because it's been increasingly difficult to do them in Russia. And we got a lot of criticism for that. Like, why are you sending people to Moldova or to Georgia to study Russian? And there was even a petition of Russianists to stop us from sending people to Georgia to study Russian. It's just a bad example. They don't speak pure Petersburg Standard and so forth. This year we're doing it again because our programs in Russia were directly shut down, and we're unable to do those programs. So we're getting even more. We're sending several tens of 30 students to Georgia this summer to study. And it is a little bit like sending people to Puerto Rico to improve their English, but the way Russian is spoken in the periphery is a version of Russian, right? It is, and something we're studying, and it is a entryway, I think, into the periphery, into studying these different parts of this continuum that in the past they wouldn't see if they went to study in St. Petersburg or Moscow. And I would be very surprised if the discussion about decolonizing the curriculum, if we get those kind of petitions and complaints about sending people to further out in the periphery, and to begin to think more about and get this understanding, as Ron said, of the ways in which the periphery really began to colonize the center in the Russian and Soviet empires in the same way that happens in most empires, if not all.
I think I'm aware that I have another quite a few questions. So if people could be quite brief, with their questions and their answers. That'd be great. Our visitor from back, please.
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Jeremy. Give me if I got it wrong, but it seemed to me that the idea was to argue for Georgia as the Republic in the Soviet Union and to show its unique examples. And I wanted to ask, have you considered perhaps within the context of decolonization, trying to portray Georgia as valuable as such, like not just because it's significant to the center of decision making to Russia, but its achievements being considered just because it deserves a voice in that kind of context. Like, have you considered this narrative as kind of an alternative interpretation of the facts that you were talking about? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas.
Well, I have a reflection concerning your case study, Timothy. Thank you very much. Because I think, that the Melnikov case is more important than it looks like. Not in the national context, but in the context of reforms, serious reforms. Because Melnikov was criticized because of national treatment, of bad treatment of nationalities, and of course, very uninsolent and dirty hands. And within these reforms, I would be curious whether you look at the formulations in the criticism, because I have read the document in that volume about Beria, and it is not about Khrushchev criticizing Melnikov, it is how the criticism is formulated. Could it, in the next step, damage Khrushchev's own career? This is an important question for me. And he was, in danger. So the second context is the battle for power, because there was a parallel case in Belarus, which was the case of Patolychev, who was supposed to be replaced by Zilianin. Patolychev, Susan mentioned Patolychev today in the late 60s when he was dealing as a minister with oil export, but he was there, and Khrushchev stopped that. Okay, so what is your, what is the consequence and what is the context? Because I have some suggestion for you, but we can take it later concerning what I have heard, because I had an interview in the 90s with Zilianin, and he mentioned that as well.
I just intervened there because Patolychev wasn't saved so much by Khrushchev, but so it may be a more complex comparison than all that. But I'll get back to the other 4 questions later, but first let's see the speaker's notes.
So about the formulation of criticisms, and one thing that I think is interesting, and that hasn't come to light at all, except in this Ukrainian language biography of Melnikov, is that actually Melnikov had been particularly attentive to national questions in Western Ukraine, and they had actually been increasing and making efforts to recruit party secretaries, obkom, raikom, komsomol secretaries. They had increased from 13% to 26% from the beginning of 1951 up until April 1953, so doubling basically the number. And I think that was Melnikov's objection when these complaints were first raised, that we actually are doing these things and that these criticisms are a pretext and sort of manipulated in that way. What the further consequence might have been for Beria, rather for Khrushchev later in that competition, I'm not so sure, and I do look forward, we can talk about that. On the case of Patolychev, that is an interesting one. I didn't bring it up, and I'd be interested to talk to you too about what you think about that. It does, I mean, overtly, it just seems that Melnikov simply had no protection, he had no Khrushchev, whereas Patolychev actually did seem to have a relationship with Khrushchev, and he was actually removed. The same procedures were taken for Melnikov. It's just they didn't go through with it, and they decided to throw out the decision, or not to officially register. The decision was taken in the Presidium, and then it would have to be ratified by the new republic.
But the problem was that the Republican regional leaders refused effectively to get rid of Patolychev. And when this was presented to Khrushchev and presumably also Manitoba, but Khrushchev played a bigger part in that. Khrushchev just accepted that and said, okay, but if that's what you want, but the initiative for Patolychev came from the left.
And there was also
the scenario was the same.
there was also support for Melnikov Ukrainians, and even among these Western Ukrainians that there are these Ukrainian representatives of the Presidium who they had assembled, particularly the head of the Verkhovna Rada, Kotarenko. He actually stood up for Melnikov in these discussions. He himself was harshly criticized and had to turn it down. But you do have a continuing patronage relationship. Was a major of Khrushchev in later years.
I just wanted to say quickly, like, these kinds of cases crop up in my research as well, and sometimes you can say no, and sometimes you can't. And the larger sort of context.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I've got lots of answers to it, so I'll try and keep it brief. I mean, so there are different levels here. You know, the one there is clearly a competition within the South Caucasus between these three, which are over territory and history. You know, the kind of history wars and things, and then the real wars which erupt at the end of the 1980s, and then there's the Soviet Union, and then there's very much internationally. So yeah, I mean. Absolutely, and especially during this period, during the Khrushchev time, when there was this opportunity for, Georgia, I mean, and I suppose other republics to kind of have their own foreign policies to some extent. I mean, their own trade at least, and their own international exchanges and things like this. And this was very much a part of what was going on with the wine industry, with the tea industry, and more generally with cultural exchanges and things like that. So I think that. Georgia being promoted in its own right, very much. This was a part of it, and Georgia. Georgia has a long history. Georgia was the center of attention of much of the social democratic left during the 1918 to 1921, and it was the attention of a lot of the international community and the EU after 1991 as well. And I mean, the other point I kind of feel it's relevant here. I'm not quite sure how, but the point I tried to make in my book is a lot of the processes we see as the nation building processes of the 1990s were already going on. They were already going on as long ago as the 1950s, and including things like architecture, which I haven't mentioned. But I mean, this goes on all around the Soviet Republic. So very much, this is part of the. I've heard some really interesting stuff on Lithuania at Saulius's conferences in Vilnius. This kind of nation building is another way of looking at it. I suppose what I'm focusing, it's part of the Soviet republic's experience. But what I'm focusing now is the kind of competitive element on it here. But that certainly doesn't preclude what you were saying. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So, Tim. So I'm loving it, and I think it is I mean, it is a great contribution to this period with what you discovered about Stalin's own triumphs in this way. Just a quick question, really, was that did I misunderstand? You said that referring to these shifting alliances of the three of them. Are you saying that there was no cooperation with Berия and Khrushchev, as in that was wrong, or are you saying that there was no alliance? Because I think that's two separate things. I just want to make clear that I got it right with what you're saying. With Orysia, tons of food for thought there that we should all be thinking about digesting, figuratively speaking, for Friday's discussion. And particularly I've circled it several times. I think the integration and institutionalization of Ukrainian studies is such an important thing to grow. And I think when we talk about just what Tim interjected about will students keep studying the periphery, and I think if the people in this room have anything to say about it, that will be the case. It will remain away. And then I just want to ask Jeremy come back to maybe this point about the point of the boasting. I think it's a really interesting thing, this Third Republic idea. I really like it. But who is it for? Is it domestic consumption? Is it, I think, with something to what Yoram was getting at? Is it national pride and bolstering of that, or is it as simple as look, Moscow, we actually do a good job here and we're worthy of greater investment. I mean, so I'd be very curious as to who's the object here, because it's quite clear from what you're getting at that the party was really going for this what could be some form of like, it's almost like PR branding, you know. And so it's sort of so, and there's always someone in mind for that. So yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I basically agreed with Ron's comments completely about this issue about, you know, enhancing the study of the periphery. We have all these people here. We have this whole conference that is so much focused on this issue of looking at Russian Soviet history through the lens of the periphery. And on that note, you know, I'm not thrilled about this idea of framing it in like a colonial decolonization kind of a thing. But I will say, I think we should do more of this. We should do more focusing on, because the Soviet Union is not just Russia. Unfortunately, since the dissolution of the USSR in 1991, there has been a kind of mentality adopted among many Russians of kind of a Russian nation stateism, where you talk to young Russians and you talk about Armenia's contributions to the Soviet Union, and they don't know anything about that, or Georgia, or Ukraine, or these other republics. They just think it was our state, it was our country, and that's it. And that's not true. It was a multi-ethnic state. And that's something else I want to emphasize in the research myself. But I don't think the decolonization or post-colonial narratives will necessarily help with that process. But it's a dialogue we need to have, because we need to emphasize again the USSR as a fact was a multi-ethnic state with different republics who helped form that history, who helped form the common history of common people, of a Soviet people. So that's, I think, one thing I think is going to be very valuable moving forward as we delve into looking at the Soviet Union, not just as Moscow or Leningrad. And part of it is also the fact, frankly, that, you know, especially with Western scholarship, you need a starting point. So they start with Moscow, they start with Leningrad. Now, more and more and more, we're getting to learn more about this society, this system, through you know, other parts of this country as well, and also Central Asia, which we haven't even mentioned. We talk also about, you know, the Baltic states. Even here, the cases in the Baltic states are not universal with all republics. So yeah, maybe the second secretary may be a Russian in Latvia, but it's not the case in Armenia. I mean, everybody is kind of distinct in their own way. So yeah, I definitely think that we should do more of this, kind of looking at the USSR through a multi-ethnic lens, but not necessarily through a post-colonial lens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Which is important. So, can I have quickly the answers to this, and possibly we'll have to leave the two questions to the coffee break, I'm told.
So I can answer Michael's question very quickly, and that's, I think, yes, definitely cooperation. I don't think there was an alliance of Beria and Khrushchev directly against Melnikov.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
My response would be a question. Why do you resist the post-colonial frame or decolonization?
Because
On what grounds?
The USSR was a colonial empire. I mean, we have this debate. I mean, there was actually even this debate with regard to Central Asia. You have people who spoke about making Uzbekistan, you're pushing back against this idea that maybe it's more of a mobilizational state, and you know, certainly not a colonial empire. I mean, how does the Soviet Union treat its republics? Do they treat them as colonies?
Sometimes.
Or is it treating it?
Yeah.
I mean, all the time, though. I mean, this is a big question within. And maybe it's not for this afternoon. Maybe it's not for, you know, I mean, maybe you need a whole conference on that.
Well,
because there's a lot of discussion.
if I may,
we had you know, serious debates on these questions.
there was an imperial term that obviously didn't take substantial root in Russian and Soviet studies.
We have this conference. I mean,
It depends on, you know, your understanding of what that means. And if, you know, I know there's great resistance to thinking of the Soviet Union as an empire. There are also conversations and books, research that suggests otherwise. So I don't think at the outset, at this particular moment in time, that it's helpful to reject just out of hand a possible avenue forward. Because
I would say also that I think why Jeremy's concept of, and why the Third Republic concept was important in Georgia is because it was a hierarchy, and that's why it was an empire. It was a hierarchy, and it was one in republics which were tied to ethnicity, had different rankings and different values and different, these abstract things about where you stand on this hierarchy was reflected in real results of real investment, of real position of what you get.
And I would just add, if, you know, as Ron said, this is a moment as consequential as the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you're not rethinking your arguments, your approach, and you feel, you know, I don't want to go that way, then I think you're perhaps too solidly moored to your foundations.
Well, the other question I would have.
Like
is how do you
openness,
define a colonial
openness.
empire versus an empire itself. So maybe you could make the case that the USSR was imperial or an empire, but can you say it was a colonial empire, like Britain in the 19th century or something like that? And this is, but I'm not saying we should debate this now, but this is something for food. This is like food for thought. That scholars have debated these issues. Was the Russian Empire colonial? Was the Soviet Union colonial? I mean, this is a major issue that I don't think we'll be able to resolve, but I will say that.
So maybe we can leave that for Friday.
Yes.
And then as
But
a
I will
compromise
say
solution,
though that
never ought
we
to now.
need, I think that studying more of the so-called periphery perspective, I think is definitely warranted, and I think that this field, I'm an optimist like Ron. I share this view that we are moving in the right direction. So.
I'm conscious that we didn't get Jeremy an opportunity to answer, and
Oh,
then
well.
we'll break for tea.
I think Tim answered my question. No, I just no, we'll just say next. I've been given a list of memoirs to read. I've got a research assistant in Tbilisi, so I might be able to do a bit of oral history. So I don't have a clear answer, but I could also answer the question: Does there need to be a point? You know, you know, just legacy things like this. I'm not sure, so I don't have an answer. I'll get back to you in a couple of years or a year, hopefully. But I'm not sure there really needs to be a concrete. You know, all those things you said, yes, maybe, but I don't think it needs to be that concrete. Perhaps.
My apologies to Natalya and Alex for not running out of time, but perhaps you could.
I'm sorry.
Well, now I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking Ilia speakers.
Right, okay, we have cake, we have sweets, treats, we have enough coffee. Alex, I think a battleship next door, so go get some.